Have you ever wondered how artificial intelligence is helping solve medical problems? Or how medical research is making it easier to predict your genetic risks for disease? Hi, I'm Kathy Werzer. Tomorrow's Cure, a podcast from Mayo Clinic and PRX, is back for Season 2. Join me as I interview experts who are shaping the future of healthcare with groundbreaking advancements. What they describe may sound futuristic, but listen and you'll find out. Tomorrow's Cure is already here. Find it now wherever you get your podcasts.
I probably wouldn't say to swallow a stick of butter every day.
This is On Nutrition, a podcast from Mayo Clinic where we dig into the latest nutrition trends and research to help you understand what's health and what's hype. I'm Tara Schmidt, a registered dietitian with Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. This episode, Understanding Dietary Fats and Cholesterol. We're used to seeing both of these when we check a nutrition label. But do they benefit our body? Do they increase our chance of heart disease? And do I need to stop eating eggs or not? To answer those questions, I've enlisted the help of Dr. Kyla Lara-Breitenger, a cardiologist at Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. She works with patients on lowering their risk of cardiovascular disease, which has a lot to do with the fats and cholesterol in their diet. Hi, Dr. Lara-Breitenger. Thanks for being here today.
Thank you for inviting me, Tara. It's so nice to talk with you again.
So on the topic of fat, we're going to start with something super fun.
Okay.
The 80s and the 90s. Not only the fun fashion and Saved by the Bell, but fat. When the 1980 to 1985 dietary guidelines for America came out, they literally said, avoid too much fat. Mm-hmm. And those on the committee thought that it would be too complex to describe the specificities. So what does America do? We go make everything fat-free. Fat-free yogurt, fat-free cookies, fat-free chips. By the way, they're disgusting.
True.
No one wants a fat-free chip. Gross.
No.
And what do you do to make a chip taste good? A cookie tastes good when you take all the fat. You add sugar. Uh-huh. So do you think that that harmed people's perception of fat?
Absolutely. And I think even now, even when I see patients with cardiovascular disease, they assume that even diets that we promote are associated with low fat only. It's so interesting how we've come a long way. And as we know, diet is so controversial and continues to be plastic. So who knows what we'll be talking about maybe in 10 or 20 years.
Yeah. And I always remind my patients that research changes, right? So maybe we were quote unquote wrong in the 80s. Maybe we had the right information, but we didn't share it appropriately with the public. Maybe there wasn't enough information out there. So these things will continue to change as we gain more evidence-based research. I'm so glad that era is over because we know a lot more now about the benefits of dietary fat. Can you tell us why it's important?
We need fat to metabolically function. We need cholesterol that comes from fat, for the membranes in all of our cells, for our eye health. And we know from large trials from Europe where a high fat that's from olive oil and nuts and fatty fish and moderate amounts of protein with fat, and then are very protective in terms of longevity and cardiovascular disease. It just determines on which kind of fat you're intaking.
So when we think about fat in our diet, we have, you could technically say 4 different kinds. We've got trans fat, we've got saturated, we've mono and polyunsaturated. Talk through the differences in those in terms of risk. Do I do mono? Do I do poly?
It's very confusing for most people, unless we're chemists or remember our organic chemistry. How are we supposed to remember poly, moly, mono, trans? And so when I was doing my master's in nutrition on the East Coast many, many years ago, I won't say how many, that was when trans fats became illegal and they stopped allowing trans fats. Trans fats were made chemically to add and alter the chemical compound of a liquid fat to make it solid. And basically, they found a strong association with poor outcomes, including cardiovascular disease and other bad metrics of health. So then they banned that across our country. And so trans fat no longer is in the picture.
What about saturated fat?
Saturated fat just basically means the fats are saturated with hydrogen ions, which is a type of molecule in our body. And so when it's saturated with hydrogen molecules, they're basically solid at room temperature. So saturated fat is the fat that we talk about as being bad fat. And most saturated fats come from animal fat. So from eating animals and also from dairy. When you get your pint of ice cream and it's full fat, if you look at the ingredients label, the saturated fat will be like 30% or higher per serving. So they're pretty high. And then the animal protein that's associated more with increased saturated fats are going to be your red meats, for instance, compared to fish and seafood and poultry without skin.
And lastly, we have our unsaturated fats, polyunsaturated and monounsaturated. The poly and the mono prefixes have to do with their makeup at a molecular level, but can you tell us more about them?
The poly and monounsaturated fats are the types of foods that you hear about, like omega-3 fatty acids, polyunsaturated, omega-6 fatty acids. Those are going to be all of your olive oils, canola oils, most of the nuts. Obviously we talk about walnuts and almonds as being very high in those types of good fats as well. And then most of the seed oils. And that's all of the fats that, even though they contain fat, they have been also linked and associated in the science with improving cardiovascular disease risk, being anti-inflammatory, having antioxidant effects, and being healthy for the microbiome.
Almost all dietary fats are going to be a combination of saturated and unsaturated. Even olive oil, right, is a combination of both of these things. It's higher in unsaturated. Butter is higher in saturated. The easiest thing to know, I've said this in every single cooking class I've ever taught, is what does it look like at reasonable room temperature? So if you're in your air-conditioned kitchen and it is pourable at room temperature, examples being avocado oil, olive oil, even canola oil, those are higher in unsaturated fats. And then we have, you can call them solid or semi-solid if you want to get scientific, of things that are going to be higher in saturated fat. Coconut oil is higher in saturated fat because it comes where you can scoop it out with a spoon. You can't pour it unless you take it outside in Florida, right? Shortening, lard, even looking at the marbling of a steak. If you look at a raw steak, you can see the white. That is the fat. And that's, again, why a steak tastes good. In a fish, you can't see the fat.
Absolutely.
So that's why we tell people to prioritize eating more unsaturated fats than saturated fats. But what's the benefit of eating more unsaturated fats?
So omega-3s and omega-6 fatty acids, these have been shown time and time again, especially in those international trials, that the consumption of these poly and monounsaturated fats that primarily come from extra virgin olive oil and salmon and avocados actually are antioxidants. They're heart protective or cardioprotective, and they actually have an inverse association with heart attacks, strokes, etc. And so they help the body rid and keep the bad cholesterol down, in addition to obviously exercise and minimizing being sedentary. And so these are really the types of fats that we want to recommend to everybody out there. That fat is not something to be afraid of, but it's important to look at and shoot for these mono and poly unsaturated fats.
More often than saturated.
Right.
The guidelines have always essentially said to have more unsaturated, but for a long time that was communicated or interpreted as less fat, period. So now the dietary guidelines for Americans are pretty clear, and they say, please replace your saturated fats with more unsaturated fats, and ideally, woohoo, trans fat is gone.
And even in the studies for Mediterranean diet, some of the supplementation they gave in terms of giving food were mixed nuts.
Yes.
And everybody knows out there, if you're just purely looking at fat and calories, if you look at the nutrition label for nuts, it's, my gosh, you'd run away from them. But they're actually, we recommend almonds and cashews and nuts because a lot of the times with a higher fat content, you'll probably eat less because you get satiated a lot earlier.
Yes, honestly, one of my best examples for a quote-unquote healthy snack is a handful of nuts and something like an apple. So now we have a little bit of protein in the nuts, fat. Both of those things are satiating or help you feel full. We've got an apple, which has high water content, high fiber content, also helping you feel full. Both of those foods are fabulous for cholesterol and heart health. Like, bing, bang, boom. There we go, everyone.
Yep.
It's a great snack.
Perfect balance.
So to reiterate, we want to target unsaturated fats over saturated fats because saturated fats are a lot less healthy for us. But how do ultra-processed foods fit into the picture?
I think probably if there's one thing to remember from our entire conversation is exactly what you just said, because based on the data, there's a longitudinal cohort of American people they follow over decades. They did an analysis in the early 2000s with several thousands of adults looking at their baseline consumption of ultra processed foods. Ultra processed means there's barely anything or no real food in the contents. And they looked at these participants 10 years later and they found the average consumption at baseline for an American for ultra processed foods was 7.5 servings per day. And then they found that every additional serving on top of 7.5 servings per day of an ultra processed food item was associated with anywhere from a 5 to 9% increased risk from cardiovascular disease or cardiovascular mortality. There's a lot of saturated fat put in these ultra processed foods, and it's not even real food, and it's associated very strongly with cardiovascular disease.
When someone picks up a label, what should they be looking for if their goal is to be more mindful of their fat intake?
So what I tell patients really is to look at the nutrition label, and with the exception of nuts and the oils that we use for cooking or for adding to vegetables when we're looking at our packaged foods, is to look more at the total fat. So if you're seeing saturated fats, we really want to minimize that to less than 10%. So if you're already seeing an item that's showing 12% or more, or 20%, right, that is something that we would try to stay away from. And then in terms of poly and monounsaturated fats that can be listed also, the higher the better.
I completely agree. And something that I have a conversation about frequently is we don't eat singular foods. We have a pattern of eating. We have habits. So for that person who wants to eat ice cream or wants to drink whole milk or wants to have a really good steak on a Friday night, that's probably okay if I hear about the other 97% of their diet and it's good. Same thing with adding butter to vegetables instead of olive oil. If someone really loves to cook with butter because that's their preference, they love to cook with coconut oil, I can handle that if it's going to add more vegetables to your diet and there's not a bunch of other sources laying around somewhere.
Life is short. If there's something you're really craving, like ice cream, don't just get ice cream that's on sale because it's cheap and it's on sale and it's something that you eat and you're like, it tasted okay, but I really regret it versus, you're at the best gelato
Get the good
place.
stuff.
Yeah, if you're at the best gelato place and it's something that's like the best and you taste and you're like, that was worth it, then of course have that.
That's actually the exact same phrase that I use. I'll say, ask yourself the question, is it worth it? And when you have those higher fat items, I don't think it's very common that you overdo them, right? Like,
absolutely.
I don't think you can have a ton of really good, strong cheese that kind of makes me nauseous or a really giant steak. So I think it's okay that we enjoy these things, but making sure that it is quality and how often are you doing it?
Couldn't agree more.
Taxes was feeling so stuck. Sitting in traffic, squeezing into a parking spot, all to squeeze in getting tax help during your lunch break. Now Taxes is a TurboTax expert who does your taxes for you, while you go about your day getting real-time notifications about their progress and the most money back guaranteed. Now this is Taxes. Intuit TurboTax. Get an expert now on TurboTax.com. Only available with TurboTax Live full service, real-time updates only in iOS mobile apps. See guarantee details at TurboTax.com/guarantees.
Try to forget what you learned during the no-fat craze in the 80s and 90s, because consuming 0 grams of fat isn't inherently healthy or tasty, but it is necessary to understand the fats you'll come across in your day-to-day. So let's go over the 4 types of dietary fat one more time. Trans fats are illegal in many countries, including the US, so you shouldn't see them in your food, but if you do, know that they're the most unhealthy kind. Then there's saturated fats, the ones in dairy, red meat, and those tempting ultra-processed foods. Saturated fats are the ones that tend to be solid at room temperature, like butter or coconut oil. And beware, consuming more than 7 servings of ultra-processed foods per day increases your risk of cardiovascular disease. Then there's mono and poly unsaturated fats, found in things like avocados, nuts, and vegetable oils. They're the ones that stay liquid at room temperature. Those are the kinds you should aim to eat. Of course, these are all helpful guidelines, but don't forget to enjoy your life enjoy those saturated fats in moderation. Going for high-quality butters or ice cream will probably feel a lot better than consuming something with a ton of additives. Okay, so there's fats in our foods, and then there's cholesterol. What's the difference? And why does my doctor always tell me to keep an eye on it? Now let's talk about cholesterol. We've got all of these different fats kind of roaming around, and they're in our body, but we're also eating or consuming them. So let's define cholesterol.
Cholesterol is essential. We all need it for transporting different things in our body. We need cholesterol that comes from fat, for the membranes in all of our cells, for our eye health. But when we have too much of it, that's when we get a problem. And then the total cholesterol can be broken down into different types. And we have low density lipoprotein cholesterol particles and high density lipoprotein particles. And LDL cholesterol, as many listeners know, is a type of cholesterol that accumulates in the lining of our blood vessels, in our heart, in our brain. And that is what is the big risk factor for causing heart attacks and strokes.
How do you explain the functions or importance of HDL and LDL to your patients?
So HDL, or high density lipoprotein, many of you know that as your happy cholesterol with an H because it's a cardioprotective one. Well, you have HDL receptors, which are these kind of garbage cans, if you want to say, on your liver. And all that circulating HDL will go and grab all that cholesterol circulating in your blood, trying to accumulate in your arteries. And it kind of picks up all those bad cholesterols and brings it to your liver to metabolize. And so that's why we want more HDL cholesterol in our body, which really comes from a healthy diet and exercise, because the more of it in your circulation, the more you're removing that bad cholesterol from your body. And then the LDL cholesterol is a cholesterol that meets up with all those pro-inflammatory things in your blood and, these different immune cells. And when they have an opportunity to find a vulnerable place in your blood vessels, they're going to go ahead and stick on there. And then more come and stick on, and more LDL cholesterol stick on there. And that's when you get those big risks of having many heart attacks over the course of your life in the later decades. And really, that's why we are so focused on the type of cholesterol, because there's been decades and decades of science and people dedicating their lives to really studying the physiology of this to that degree.
So we know LDL cholesterol is raised, could be by excess body fat. So having overweight or obesity, having too much saturated fat or trans fat in your diet. HDL cholesterol, I would say, is a little bit harder to raise. So we want higher HDL cholesterol. That's the good one. So H high, H happy. I would say healthier fats in your diet, more healthy fats than unhealthy fats, like we've been talking about, but more so maybe even exercise, cardio exercise specifically, I believe is what more often raises HDL cholesterol. Like runners tend to have really awesome HDL cholesterol.
Yeah. And I totally agree with that. Definitely exercise, and even especially fiber too, and different things like that.
Do you remind people to not always only look at their total cholesterol? I feel like I've had this conversation with a number of patients of, okay, if your total cholesterol, let's say it's above 200, I'm going to look at what it is. It's just a math equation, right? So we've got your good cholesterol, HDL, your bad cholesterol, quote unquote, LDL, and 20% of your triglycerides. So in some cases, when people have really high, good cholesterol, it just skews that total number. So I'd rather focus on either the ratio or those individualized components. Do you agree with that?
I totally agree with that. Actually, regardless of what the total cholesterol is, I always take a look at each of the components, especially because HDL cholesterol is known to be very healthy for you, but there's also a ceiling of when it's too high and actually dangerous. And many lipid experts believe that an HDL cholesterol greater than 100, the HDL particles actually become dysfunctional.
You also mentioned triglycerides. What are they? Why are they important?
Triglycerides is basically just another form of fat, which is why triglycerides are under that whole total cholesterol, because it's one of the different components of cholesterol. And basically, whenever we intake fat, we can intake really high fat foods, and depending on how much sugar is in the food, alcohol, for instance, that can raise your triglycerides levels. I mean, we focus so much on LDL cholesterol, but it's important to remember that when you look at your own cholesterol levels, when you get your lab results, look at those triglycerides, because we really want to aim for, less than 150, less than 100. Anything over that has been shown in the science to increase your risk for the same things that the LDL cholesterol show. And, if you're somebody who really responds to seeing numbers go down, having your lipids checked after changing your diet and seeing that triglyceride level go down can be pretty motivating. And the one thing, if you see somebody with a very high triglyceride level, you really want to think about your alcohol intake, and those ultra processed foods and fried foods are the number one things when it comes to triglycerides. We can't leave those triglycerides out. I've had patients who've had normal LDL cholesterols, good HDL cholesterols, and super high triglycerides, and they've come in with a major heart attack and they've needed stents in their hearts. And so we can't pretend the triglycerides don't play a role, even if those other cholesterols are kind of in the okay range.
Yeah. You mentioned alcohol. That's a really big one for triglycerides. Simple carbohydrates, so sugars. So either refined carbs, white things. I kind of hate when people say that, but I think most people understand.
Yeah.
As opposed to whole grain, non-whole grain things, sweets. In excess, they may increase your calorie consumption, which makes you gain weight, and then it's going to impact the other numbers. But also, they're going to directly impact triglycerides. And those can move faster, I would say, than the cholesterols, the LDL and the HDL.
Oh, totally.
Do we want to debunk cholesterol? So eating cholesterol, shrimp, eggs, I think are the best examples here, raising your cholesterol in the blood.
Right. So, a few decades ago, there was this whole marketing and concern that the more dietary cholesterol you ate, the higher your serum cholesterol, or when your doctor checks your blood cholesterol, would raise. And they actually found that there really wasn't that strong of a correlation. And so I would say out there, instead of looking at the cholesterol levels in your nutrition labels, really, again, looking at the amount of saturated fat and the type of saturated fat. The whole egg controversy the pendulum has swung back and forth and back and forth. And the most recent data on meta-analyses, which is looking at multiple trials of large cohorts of people, found that, moderate egg intake, which is about an egg per day, really was not harmful.
Yolk
and there's
specifically.
Exactly, yolk specifically. So have all the egg whites you want. And they really found that, really looking at the lipid panel, if someone enjoys a lot of eggs and seeing what that does, because there's hyper responders to eggs and there's not. And so again, I say, don't worry about the cholesterol levels, worry about the saturated fat. I'm not saying to have, 6 eggs a day either.
I would like to ask what the replacement would be or what the alternative would be, right? So if you're eating eggs with a little bit of cheese and some spinach and making this beautiful, colorful omelet, and you have a few yolks a week, let's say you have an omelet on the weekends or you enjoy a few hard-boiled eggs throughout the week, that's fine.
I couldn't agree more with that. And when I give talks on diet in these cardiovascular conferences, that's almost always asked, like, should I not be eating any egg yolks? And they're like, well, there's so many other vitamins in eggs that are essential and they're healthy. So it's exactly what you stated. What else are you eating with it? But eggs themselves are not the culprit. They've looked at dietary cholesterol and how it translates into your serum cholesterol from your blood. And there really isn't that direct correlation even.
It's not as strong as we think.
Right.
And shrimp is another example. We still have people be like, oh, I can't eat shrimp. It's high in cholesterol. I'm like, okay, but you're eating a burger. Like,
eat the shrimp. Oh, they're so much more delicious.
Cholesterol is a waxy substance in our blood that makes membranes, cells, and hormones. It already exists in our bodies, but our overall diet can also determine how our cholesterol levels fluctuate. Excess body fat and eating a lot of saturated fats can build up LDL cholesterol, or low-density lipoprotein, in our arteries, which can block the flow of blood and lead to a heart attack or stroke, which is why we want to prioritize HDL cholesterol, or high-density lipoprotein, through exercise and eating lots of fiber. It's like the garbage man of your blood, delivering all the excess cholesterol to your liver where it gets flushed out. So when you get your blood drawn at the doctor's, you want to make sure your HDL levels are high, keeping you healthy, and your LDL levels are fairly low. Then there are triglycerides, which are technically a type of fat in your blood that we use for energy, but they're usually measured along with cholesterol. And just like LDL cholesterol, you want to keep those triglycerides low, as they also increase your risk of heart attack, stroke, type 2 diabetes, and metabolic syndrome. So what can you do to keep that lipid panel within a healthy range? Contrary to popular belief, it's not as much about the cholesterol you eat. Reduce or avoid smoking, saturated fats, alcohol, added sugar, and refined carbohydrates. And as always, keep up a healthy diet and exercise routine. Eating egg yolks here and there is just fine. Now let's get into how fat and cholesterol interact, their impact on your heart, and some best practices for your diet.
So do you want to talk about some of the cardiac risks that you see every day with your patients?
Absolutely. So really, when it comes to a high fat diet, especially in that saturated fat that we keep repeating over and over again, that's when we get into trouble with seeing those LDL cholesterols. In particular, the higher your saturated fat, the higher your LDL cholesterol. But in general, LDL cholesterol is going to be that main player that will be going into those arteries that supply all the oxygen and nutrients to your heart and to your brain, and really cause that risk and that increased risk for heart attacks, strokes, and cardiovascular disease that we're really just trying to prevent out there.
We saw a huge increase in people's LDL cholesterol in clinic. We saw this when coconut oil went crazy.
Oh.
Did you see this?
Yes.
Not in research, everyone, like in the clinic with my patients. We were like, why is everyone's LDL? And we're like, oh, coconut oil's trending. It's high in saturated fat. It's higher than lard in saturated fat.
It's terrible. It's one of the most mismarketed healthy, in quote, foods that most of the people are being not honest about with the consumer, saying that this is really healthy and this and that. But there's plenty of data to show that, man, if there's one thing, if you have somebody out there who eats a whole plant-based diet and clean diet, etc., and they're wondering why their LDL cholesterol is high, ask them what they're cooking their food in. And many people are using coconut oil for sure.
And I also want to make it known that if you love making homemade popcorn with coconut oil, that's great. Go for it. I love making my very famous chocolate chip cookies with butter, and no one's going to change that about me. But as your main source of fats, we would like those to be unsaturated. So you don't have to throw it away. You can also rub it on your skin or put it in your hair. I'm cool with that. But we don't want a saturated fat to be your main source. It's about your frequency, your pattern of eating, right?
Absolutely. And I was working on a talk a few weeks ago, and I came across Socrates as thou should not live to eat, you should eat to live. And so really just eating enough to sustain and having those once in a while things that make life feel good and happy, but not in excess.
When we think about people diagnosed with high cholesterol or hyperlipidemia, do they need to be more focused on their dietary fat intake because they already have blockages in their arteries?
Someone who has no history of blockages in their heart versus someone who has known disease and they went in with a heart attack and they got a stent, or they were medically treated, or they had a bypass surgery because of their heart disease, then the conversation changes because they have a predisposition or a family history because somebody else their age is not having these things happen to them. So for those patients, I tend to say a very low saturated fat. And like if that patient who was having one serving a week of very high quality filet mignon, and the rest of his diet was spectacular, and he still came in with a heart attack, then I would say maybe we need to even limit that further, obviously with the help of other kind of cholesterol lowering medications that we could introduce. And so definitely if you have a history or active kind of blockages in your heart, going for the low saturated, increasing the amount of plants and vegetables and fruits and grains is really going to help reverse and decrease and stabilize the current kind of blockages in the heart.
Do we give different patients different cholesterol goals? So my cholesterol goal is under 130 and someone else's is under 100. But if you've already had a procedure related to heart health, maybe you should be even lower. So it's not a one size fits all in terms of what should my cholesterol be, right?
Absolutely. And I mean, you will find people from both sides of the table screaming what they think the cutoff should be. But based on the science, if you've never had a heart attack, then overall the thinking was anything less 130 was probably fine. But then even more recently, a lot of people who've dedicated their lives to science and studying lipids are saying, we're born with a cholesterol level or an LDL cholesterol level of 20 to 40. And so what determines longevity? Is it like the uptick of this LDL cholesterol floating in our body from our lifestyle that then causes microvascular disease or blockages in the smallest blood vessels in our brain, our kidneys, and our heart? And so a lot of the times your diet is only one component, that you have a genetic predisposition, because someone who eats the same saturated fat diet as somebody else, they might have a different response in their LDL levels. And so determining that is basically the art and the science of that person in front of you, and kind of doing small risk assessments of other parts of their life.
What do we say about the influx of high-fat diets? Is it keto? Is it Atkins? Is it Mediterranean? Am I supposed to do more fat, less fat? I thought I was supposed to do more carbs. I'm a dietitian and I think it's exhausting, let alone someone who is a consumer trying to learn something.
Oh my gosh, I couldn't agree more with you. And so the bottom line is we don't have long longitudinal studies over decades to see the effects of these diets. Very clearly, they've done meta-analyses looking at multiple hundreds of studies of diets and saying which one is the best one. And it comes down to which one is sustainable by the patient. Which one can the patient do over the course of their lifetime? When it comes to very restricted carbohydrates, where, 70 to 80% of all your calories are coming from fat, less than 5% is coming from carbs, and the rest is this moderate protein of like 10 to 20%. Don't check my math on that. But
I will.
But basically, number one, you'll meet a group of people who've tried that diet and they lose a ton of weight. They have mental clarity. They don't have the crashes from insulin and glucose after a meal, and they couldn't feel better. And then the question is do those people sustain that diet over the course of their life? And most of the time it's a no. However, I've met more and more groups of people who swear by the keto diet. It does have really great effects on hemoglobin A1C, or that test we do to check your diabetes. But when it comes to whether or not they're healthy, that's the current question. There is no data on that yet. But really, most of us are going to develop cardiac disease or cardiovascular disease starting at 60 years or later. So you'd have to follow someone on a ketogenic diet now in their 30s or something and follow them. And that would be a very expensive study to do over 40 years and making sure they're compliant on this. And so when it comes to the ketogenic diet, I used to be no, absolutely not. And I've learned through time and much research that we don't know. So a way to check if it's safe is looking at your cholesterol levels. If you're on a ketogenic diet and your cholesterol levels are more so okay, and you don't have a family history, or your dad and your grandpa didn't have a stroke or a heart attack in their 40s or 50s, probably okay. But having that conversation with your dietitian or your healthcare professional to determine that is going to be really important. But I tend to say a variety of foods is better than 80% fat, because I don't think we were evolved to eat 80% fat to be able to be like the strongest and most intelligent, species out there in the world.
So we've had a lot of media attention on fat. Remember, there was this Times magazine that did it say butter is back? And it was just like a stick of butter, and then everyone started eating butter again. And then we've got coconut oil, and is that good or is that bad? So in general, it's of course multifactorial, right? If we add more fat to our diet, that is going to add more calories, because that's the most caloric macronutrient. But we're also talking about the benefits of these mono and poly unsaturated fats. Ideally avoid trans, and we're limiting saturated. Is fat the enemy?
I love that we're closing with that, because the easiest answer, it is no. Fat in general is not the enemy, but the quality of your fat, I think, matters. And that's exactly what you said. And so the stick of butter, I probably wouldn't say to swallow a stick of butter every day.
Or put it in your coffee?
Yes, the coffee butter. Now
People do that.
I prefer the new trend of olive oil in the coffee. So it's like olive oil, polyunsaturated, monounsaturated fats, and their improvement in cardiovascular health versus a stick of butter. I think I will choose the olive oil. And so definitely, I think fat has its role in our diet in terms of very good benefits in terms of heart health. And it's really focusing on limiting saturated fat, especially if you already have a risk from family history or a risk from, other diseases that you already have.
I agree. Well, thank you so much for your time, Dr. Lara-Breitenger. I appreciate hanging out with you today.
I know. I always love hanging out with you, Tara, and thank you so much for inviting me.
So there is a direct link between the fats in our diet and our cholesterol. The higher your intake of saturated fat, the higher your LDL levels. In other words, coconut oil is nice for popcorn and some side dishes, but not for daily use. No matter what you call it, a balanced diet of whole grains, fruits and vegetables, lean proteins, unsaturated fats, and low-fat dairy is almost always going to help reduce the risk of cardiac issues down the line. It's about moderation. Fat is not the enemy, and neither are eggs. That's all for this episode. But if you've got a question or topic suggestion, you can leave us a voicemail at 507-538-6272. We might even feature your voice on the show. For more On Nutrition episodes and resources, check us out online at mayoclinic.org/onnutrition. And if you found this show helpful, please subscribe and make sure to rate and review us on your podcast app. It really helps others find our show. Thanks for listening, and until next time, eat well and be well.
Have you ever wondered how artificial intelligence is helping solve medical problems, or how medical research is making it easier to predict your genetic risks for disease? Hi, I'm Kathy Werzer. Tomorrow's Cure, a podcast from Mayo Clinic and PRX, is back for Season 2. Join me as I interview experts who are shaping the future of healthcare with groundbreaking advancements. What they describe may sound futuristic, but listen and you'll find out. Tomorrow's Cure is already here. Find it now wherever you get your podcasts.
This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as medical or legal advice. Always consult with a qualified healthcare provider for any medical questions. The appearance of any guest does not imply an endorsement of them, their employer, or any entity they represent. The views and opinions are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views of Mayo Clinic. Reference to any product, service, or entity does not constitute an endorsement of or recommendation by Mayo Clinic.